Daniel Harper noticed the silence before he noticed anything else, the kind of silence that sat heavy in the air and followed him from room to room, and on that autumn evening in Boston it felt thicker than usual as city lights blinked on outside the apartment window and the hum of traffic below sounded far away, like a life happening somewhere else, because inside the apartment everything felt paused, unfinished, and slightly broken in ways that had no clear starting point, and Daniel stood in the kitchen holding his phone without looking at it, thinking about how love could still exist and yet feel so distant, how marriage could turn quiet without anyone meaning for it to happen, and when he finally walked toward the bedroom he already knew what Emily would say because the pattern had repeated itself for months now, and sure enough her voice came soft and tired from under the blanket. "I'm too tired tonight," not cold, not angry, just worn down, and Daniel nodded even though she wasn't looking, because he had learned that pushing only made the distance worse, and as he turned back toward the living room he felt a familiar mix of understanding and loneliness settle into his chest, remembering how Emily used to laugh easily, how she once reached for him without thinking, how long hospital shifts and constant pressure had slowly taken pieces of her energy until even small moments felt like heavy tasks, and Daniel didn't blame her, not really, but he missed being seen. Missed being more than someone who quietly adjusted his needs to fit into her exhaustion, and he tried to distract himself by straightening the couch pillows and rinsing an already clean mug when the doorbell rang, sharp and sudden, breaking the stillness, and when he opened the door he found Rachel Collins standing there with a small paper bag and a gentle smile that looked both familiar and cautious, Emily's best friend since college, someone who had always been part of their shared life. Someone Daniel trusted without ever questioning why. And Rachel stepped inside, brushing rain from her coat, saying she brought soup because Emily had texted that she wasn't feeling well, and Daniel thanked her, noticing how naturally she moved through the apartment, like a person who belonged there, and when Emily came out briefly to hug her friend and thank her before returning to bed, the apartment grew quiet again, but this time it was a different kind of quiet, filled with unspoken thoughts, and Daniel and Rachel sat across from each other in the living room, their mugs of tea cooling untouched as rain tapped steadily against the windows, and for a few moments neither of them spoke because sometimes words felt too loud for fragile spaces, and Daniel became aware of how tired he felt too, not just physically but emotionally, tired of being careful, tired of carrying thoughts he didn't know how to share, and when Rachel finally spoke her voice was soft but direct, saying, "You don't look okay," and Daniel almost laughed because no one had said that to him in a long time, because he was usually the one asking others if they were all right, and he shrugged, unsure how much truth was safe to release, and Rachel leaned forward slightly, her expression serious but kind, and said, "You look lonely, Daniel," and the words hit him harder than he expected, not because they were dramatic, but because they were accurate, and he felt his throat tighten as he realized how long it had been since someone noticed his loneliness without him having to explain it, and he looked away toward the window, watching the blurred reflection of city lights in the glass, and Rachel followed his gaze, understanding without needing details, and she spoke again after a brief pause, her voice quieter now, almost careful, saying, "Emily is tired, I know, but that doesn't mean you stopped needing closeness," and Daniel felt both comforted and unsettled by her words, because they named something he had been afraid to admit even to himself, and he tried to respond but found that honesty didn't come easily anymore. And before he could say anything Rachel added, almost like an afterthought but with a weight that lingered in the room, "I'm not tired," and the words hung between them, not loud, not dramatic, but charged with meaning, and Daniel looked at her then, really looked at her, noticing the concern in her eyes, the steadiness in her posture, the way she seemed present in a way that felt rare lately, and for a brief moment he imagined what it would feel like to be understood without having to explain everything, and that thought scared him. Because he loved his wife, because he respected boundaries, because he knew how easily quiet moments could turn into mistakes if left unchecked, and he cleared his throat and tried to change the subject, asking about work, about traffic, about anything safer than emotions, and Rachel followed his lead, but the air had already shifted, and even as they talked about simple things Daniel felt a new awareness growing. A realization that something delicate had been touched. And when Rachel eventually stood to leave she paused by the door, hesitating as if choosing her words carefully, and said she hoped Emily felt better soon, that she was always there if they needed anything, and Daniel thanked her again, watching as she stepped into the hallway and disappeared from view, and when the door closed the apartment felt different, not quieter, but fuller, filled with thoughts Daniel didn't yet know how to sort. And as he returned to the bedroom and lay beside Emily, listening to her slow breathing, he stared at the ceiling and wondered when love had become so quiet, when caring had started to feel lonely, and why a simple sentence spoken without intention had stirred something he wished he didn't feel, knowing deep down that this was only the beginning of a story he hadn't chosen but could no longer ignore. After that evening, life moved faster than Daniel expected, not in big dramatic ways but in small shifts that quietly changed everything, because Rachel began visiting more often under normal reasons that sounded harmless on the surface, checking on Emily, dropping off groceries, staying for tea, and Daniel told himself it was natural since she had always been close to their lives, yet he noticed how different the apartment felt when she was there, how conversation flowed without effort, how laughter appeared in places where silence used to sit, and Emily, still worn down by long hospital hours, seemed grateful for the help but unaware of the subtle change happening around her, and Daniel tried to stay careful, reminding himself every day that kindness was not permission and comfort was not desire, but emotions don't always follow rules, and soon he found himself looking forward to Rachel's visits in a way that made him uncomfortable with his own thoughts. Because with Rachel he didn't have to explain why he felt empty, she simply noticed, and that noticing filled something he had been carrying alone for too long. And one rainy evening when Emily went to bed early with a headache, Daniel and Rachel sat at opposite ends of the couch, the television on but neither of them watching, and Rachel spoke about her job at a nonprofit, about stress and long hours, and Daniel realized how easy it felt to listen, how natural it was to respond without forcing words. And when he mentioned feeling invisible lately, Rachel didn't interrupt or offer advice, she just listened, her eyes steady and understanding, and that quiet attention felt more intimate than he was ready to admit, and the danger wasn't in touch or words but in the space between them where emotions were slowly growing roots, and Daniel felt guilt rise each time he caught himself smiling too easily or sharing thoughts he hadn't shared with Emily in months, and he tried to pull back, to create distance, but life kept pushing them into the same room, the same conversations, and Rachel herself seemed aware of the thin line they were walking, often pausing before she spoke, choosing her words carefully, and one night as thunder rolled outside and rain pressed hard against the windows, she finally said what both of them had been avoiding, telling Daniel she didn't want to cross any boundaries, that she respected Emily too much for that, but pretending nothing was happening felt dishonest, and Daniel felt his chest tighten because he knew she was right, because emotions don't disappear just because they are inconvenient. And he admitted, quietly, that he felt seen by her in a way he hadn't felt in a long time, and the honesty scared him because once spoken it could not be taken back, and Rachel nodded, not smiling, not leaning closer, just acknowledging the truth, and she said that loneliness could pull people together in ways they never planned, and that awareness was both a warning and a relief, and after that conversation she began leaving earlier, keeping more distance, yet the emotional pull remained, lingering in shared glances and unfinished sentences, and Daniel found himself restless at night, lying beside Emily while she slept, staring into the dark and feeling torn between loyalty and longing, between the man he promised to be and the man who was quietly breaking inside, and Emily sensed something changing even if she didn't know what it was, noticing Daniel's distracted answers, the way he sometimes seemed far away even when sitting beside her, and guilt weighed heavily on him because he never meant to hurt her, never meant to invite confusion into their marriage, but the heart doesn't always ask permission before it aches, and one afternoon Emily asked him directly if something was wrong, and Daniel almost told her everything then, but fear held him back, fear of hurting her, fear of breaking something fragile that might still be repaired, and he chose silence, not realizing that silence itself was slowly widening the cracks, and Rachel, feeling the same tension, finally decided to step back, telling Daniel one evening at the door that space was necessary before feelings grew into something unmanageable, and her voice was calm but sad, and Daniel watched her walk away knowing that restraint did not erase what had already formed, and that even without words or actions, something had shifted permanently, because part 2 of his story wasn't about betrayal or dramatic choices, but about the quiet danger of emotional closeness, about how unmet needs can create bonds where none were intended, and as Daniel closed the door and leaned against it, he understood that the hardest moments were still ahead, because once the heart wakes up, it doesn't easily fall asleep again. The truth arrived without drama, on an ordinary Sunday afternoon when sunlight filled the apartment and nothing seemed prepared for what was about to happen, because Emily noticed the change not through messages or whispers but through Daniel's silence, the way he paused before answering, the way his eyes drifted when Rachel's name came up. And that awareness slowly settled into her like a quiet alarm she could no longer ignore, so she asked him directly, standing in the kitchen with her arms folded not in anger but in fear, asking if something was wrong, and Daniel felt the weight of every choice he had avoided press down on him at once, realizing that protecting her no longer meant staying quiet, and with a steady but shaken voice he admitted he felt alone, that he felt unseen, that Rachel had listened when he didn't know how to speak. And Emily didn't interrupt, didn't raise her voice, but her eyes filled with tears that held disappointment rather than rage, and she asked if he loved Rachel, and Daniel answered honestly that he didn't know what it was, only that it scared him because it existed at all, and Emily sat down slowly, breathing through the hurt, saying she never meant to push him away, that exhaustion had emptied her more than she knew, and in that moment both of them understood that the distance between them hadn't been created by one mistake but by many quiet days of neglect and survival. And later that evening Emily asked to speak with Rachel alone, and Daniel waited in the living room while the two women talked behind a closed door, voices low, words careful, and when Rachel finally stepped out her face was calm but her eyes were red, and she spoke to Daniel at the door with a strength that surprised him, saying she cared about him deeply but cared about Emily more, that she would not be the reason a marriage collapsed. And that sometimes doing the right thing meant walking away even when it hurt, and Daniel tried to respond but found no words that could fix what had already changed, and Rachel left with dignity, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy but honest, and that night Daniel and Emily sat together for hours, not trying to solve everything but finally saying the things they had avoided, talking about missed moments, pressure, loneliness, expectations, and the quiet fear of becoming strangers. And Emily admitted she had been surviving instead of living, that she forgot how to let herself be close, and Daniel admitted he had been patient to the point of disappearing, and neither blamed the other because blame felt useless now, and nothing was magically repaired. There were tears and long pauses and uncertainty, but there was also relief in finally naming the truth, and as the night ended they understood that love didn't disappear suddenly, it faded slowly when left unattended. And whether they could rebuild it remained uncertain, but what mattered was that the pretending was over, the hidden tension exposed to light, and as Daniel lay awake beside Emily listening to her steady breathing he knew the story had reached a turning point, because once the truth is spoken it demands change, and whatever came next would require courage rather than comfort. Time moved forward with quiet determination after everything was said, not rushing to heal wounds but allowing space for change to begin, and Daniel and Emily understood that saving their marriage would not come from promises made in one emotional night but from daily choices that required effort even when it felt uncomfortable. So Emily took time off work and admitted she needed help beyond rest, beginning therapy to understand how deeply she had buried her own needs, while Daniel learned that patience did not mean silence and that love required presence, not just endurance. And their days became filled with honest conversations that were not always easy but were real, about stress, expectations, and the fear of losing each other without realizing it, and some nights were quiet again but no longer empty, because the silence now felt shared instead of lonely, and Rachel remained absent during this time, not out of anger but respect, allowing distance to do what emotions could not, and when months passed and life settled into a new rhythm, she returned carefully, meeting them for coffee in public spaces, keeping her tone warm but her boundaries clear, and Daniel felt a gentle sadness mixed with gratitude as he saw her again, understanding that what they had shared was not meant to grow into something more, but had served as a mirror showing him what was missing at home, and Rachel, with calm honesty, wished them well and stepped back once more, leaving Daniel with a sense of closure rather than regret, and slowly Emily began to feel lighter, laughing again, reaching for Daniel's hand without thinking, rediscovering parts of herself she thought were gone. And Daniel responded not with expectation but appreciation, knowing that rebuilding trust meant allowing love to return naturally, not forcing it. And one evening as they stood together in the kitchen where so many quiet moments had once passed unnoticed, Emily leaned against him and said softly that she wasn't tired, not as an invitation but as a reflection of how present she felt, And Daniel smiled because the words now carried meaning beyond relief, they carried intention, and he realized that love was not about constant excitement or perfect balance but about choosing each other again after being tested. And the story did not end with dramatic victory or permanent certainty, but with two people who had faced the edge of loss and decided to walk back together, wiser and more honest, knowing that real love is not defined by temptation or attention from others, but by the courage to stay, to speak, and to grow when walking away would have been easier. And in that understanding Daniel found peace, because the hardest lesson he learned was also the most important one, that love survives not by avoiding challenges, but by facing them with truth and commitment.